In this video, we're going to be doing some more database work with a web template. Let me go ahead and show you the setup I have before we get into the coding. Let's go ahead and look at my databases first. I have two databases. I have a test dev and a test database. The test is like your production level, and the test dev, of course, is a development level. In both of these, I have identical tables called test. In the development table, you'll see the values of Bob Smith, Becky Smith for the name, and 3327 for the age. In the production database called test, John Doe, Jane Doe, 55 and 32. So what we're going to do here in a second is we're going to run a query, but it's going to give us different results depending on what level the application is in. Is it in development level or is it in production level? And we should see either one of these sets of data show up depending on that level. Alright, so to get started, let's go to my admin tools. In my case, it's at 127.0.0.1 app template admin. Now your pathing is going to be different, of course. You should already know how to get the admin tools from the other documentation and videos. Go ahead and log in. And first thing I'll do is go to configuration, application settings, and you'll see right now we are working in the development branch. It also has a start page of login. I'm actually going to change that over to interface because I'm actually going to do a lot of work on the interface page just to show you where the data gets spit out, and I don't want to mess my login page up, so I'll do it right there on the interface. Let's go ahead and save that change. And we'll next go to configuration, database connections, and I'll need to set up my connections. Now we're actually going to set up two database connections and two queries here, one for the dev level and one for the production level. So let's go ahead and add a connection. I'll go ahead and start with a development connection. Let's give it a name here, something descriptive. For mine, I'm just going to go ahead and call it MySQL Dev. The type is going to be MySQL, username root, password, and I'm working on my local MySQL, so it's 127.0.0.1. Could be anywhere for you, of course. Let's go ahead and test. And we have a connection successful. Let's go ahead and add that. Let's go ahead and add another connection. This time I'll choose production, and let's give it a title of MySQL Prod. Same thing, MySQL, username, password, and the address. Now they don't have to be on the exact same address. You could have a MySQL server on the internet and then another dev server, for example, on your local system. They do not have to be. Mine just has to be for this demo in the same place. So go ahead and test that connection and we're good to go. So now I have two connections, one called MySQL Dev and the other called MySQL Production. Let's go ahead and add our queries now. So let's go to configuration, database queries, and I'll choose add here. We'll have to give it some names. Now the query, what does it do? I think this one just returns names and age. Let's go ahead and say get ages. Might be a good name for it. And I'll start with the dev one, so under connection I'll choose that dev connection we just set up. Let's go ahead and go back to the MySQL Workbench and get the queries. So this one here is my dev query, and you'll see it's pulling from test_dev.test. Go ahead and copy that and paste it in here, and we go ahead and test it, and you can see it successfully returned those two rows. So I'll go ahead and add that. Now let's add our production query. I'll click add again. Query ID. Now this is important. Over in configuration database connections, you notice we have two different names, MySQL Dev and MySQL Production. That's for the connection itself. But for a auto switching query, you actually use the same name for both queries. So when I choose add here, I'm not going to type in a separate name. I'm actually going to reuse get ages. But under connection is where I choose which level I want to go to. And this one I'll choose production. Back over to MySQL Workbench, and the query is slightly different because I'm pulling from a different database altogether. So I'll use this query. I'll go ahead and test it. Return two rows. Here again, I have two rows in both tables. That doesn't tell us much. Let's go ahead and add that. And you'll see both of my connections right here. One's in development and one's in production. The query is slightly different because the databases are different, but they have identical names, and that's what allows them to auto switch. your program already knows which level it's in. It's going to use one of these two depending on that level. Alright, so next thing we're going to do is actually modify our application and try to spit out all this data to our interface. So to do that, I'm actually going to use this database query function that you see right here in this documentation, and it talks about all the inputs we need. So to use database query, all we really need is the ID of our query, which in this case is getAges. Now, if we were using a dynamic query, something that would fill in values, there is an optional array that you had to feed it for all those dynamic values. Our test right now is really simple. I just want to show you the production development levels auto switching for this one. So let's go ahead and copy that right now. Just a reminder, under documentation functions, you'll also find this function listed there with all the documentation that was found on that function page itself. Alright, so let's go ahead and open up our web folder, go into our app template, and under interface, the file I'm going to work with right now is demo.php. Now this is just set up for the template's sake, just some place I can do some testing on. You may actually want to implement it in your own files that you've created and wherever you want it to show up in the interface. So I'll go ahead and edit that. And I'm going to put the kind of data right below the demo interface file. But before I can actually do that, I have to go out and get the data using that function that we just copied. Let's see. Let's go ahead and create some JavaScript up here. Now what we want to do is, after we get the data, is feed the data into a table right below this demo interface file. But in order to do this, the page has to be fully loaded because we can't load into, like say, a div unless that div's in memory. So I'm going to use the Jquery ready command that basically executes code once the page is fully finished loading. So let me show you what that looks like in case you're not familiar with Jquery. It's very simple, $, and we're going to choose our document selector, and all we have to do is say ready. And once the ready is fired, we are going to run the code inside this function. There we go. So we'll go ahead and paste the query, or the function for the query. And remember, the only parameter we need right now is that ID that we set up as a query, which we called getAges. Now just running this does nothing because we need to insert it into a variable. So I'll just create a variable called myData, and it will go right into here. So let's go ahead and test to make sure this function is working. So right below here, I'll alert myData.length. The return of this query is a two-dimensional array, so that's how we can test the length for it. Let's go ahead and save that. Go back to Admin Tools and start our application. And there we go. It started right on the interface, and there's our alert. It says it found 3 different rows into our array. Now, you might be expecting a 2 there. Let me explain why 3 rows were returned, not 2. If we go back to this documentation, it says the data is actually starting on segment 1 of our array. 0 is always there and contains a lot of information about your query. For example, did it fail or not fail? How many actual rows returned? What keys returned? A lot of good information for doing stuff. So that's why we're actually returning 3. Alright, so we want to spit out that data right here in our interface. Now you can do your own loops and use that keys value to create your columns and do all that stuff, but I actually have another hidden function that helps us out to easily do a quick HTML table directly from that array, and it also speeds up this video. We go over here to documentation under functions, and one of these should be query array to table. There we go. Takes a two-dimensional array built by the function database query and creates an HTML table. We click Show Details, you'll see all the inputs that it needs. It needs an Into ID. This is the div that we're about to create to actually put the table into. It needs the array that holds all our data. And then it actually needs another ID that we actually want to call our table. Now this is really important because when you give your ID a table, you can then apply your style CSS to it and make it look a little different. Alright, so let's go ahead and copy that query name. And we're going to put it right here. So let's find that in our interface. There we go. Let's go ahead and create a div, and I'll give it an ID of my table data. There we go. We're going to throw all our data into that. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of our alert since we don't need that anymore. And let's actually paste that table. So it needs 3 parameters. The first parameter it needs is where we're actually going to put it. And we're going to put it in an ID called my table data. This one's a string. The next one is the array that we're actually going to, that contains the data. There it is, my data. And then the third one is what ID we actually want to give the table we create. And I'll call it my new table. There again, you're going to make up a lot of these answers yourself. Showing you an example here. Alright, let's go ahead and save that and see what happens when we refresh our page. And there we go. Name, age, Bob Smith 33, Becky Smith 27. And if you remember back over here in Workbench, we look at our dev table, that's actually the information that was in our dev. We go to production, it says differently. So let's go ahead and test that. I'll go back to Admin Tools and go to Configuration, Application Settings, and choose Production. Save that. Back to our interface and refresh. Notice the background color changed because that's one of the big differences between dev and production. You can actually set different backgrounds. But the biggest thing for this video is the data itself has changed. We're at John Doe and Jane Doe 32. Now it looks a little bleak. You can tell that the headers are correct, and that's actually how the headers are in our query. Let me show you that real quick. If I go back to database queries, let's edit that production one. If I did not want to call this one name, I can use the as statement and I'll call it title. And I'll go ahead and save that query change. Now when I go over here and refresh, it actually changed how it came in from the query itself. So if you want to be a little more unique with your header design, make sure you're creating your query properly so it has the column names you want to use your table. There again, that's only if you're using my data query to table command to actually do it. If you're doing your own table design and all that, of course you can modify that any way you like. Now the other thing is, it's really hard to see without any line spacing, so let's go ahead and add some style sheet to this table. We go to Admin Tools, under Help, Code Snippets. I already have kind of a cheat sheet here for a lot of cool CSS. One of these is a data table. There again, not saying you have to use my style sheet because there's a lot of ways you can do even better looking tables than this one here. But we'll kind of use this as a quick example. I'm going to go ahead and copy that CSS. And let's edit our style sheet. Now we look back here in the code, you remember that third parameter was my new table? That's the table ID now of our brand new table. So let's paste our CSS into our style sheet. Now this one was set up to use a class, not an ID. So I'll have to modify a little bit. So I'll do pound my new table and modify the other 2 example lines. There we go. So now we should have some CSS applied. Let's go back and refresh our application, and there we go. Title, information, age, and it looks a lot prettier. And that's pretty much it. That's how you use the database connections, the queries, how you can automate it to switch between dev and production. Let me show you one more advanced technique, because right now I'm only working on one level of my application, even though I'm manually switching it using the configuration application settings back from dev or production. That's probably not the environment you have set up. For example, let's go to the web folder, and I only have one folder right now. Typically you might have another folder, and this one might be called app template prod, or your production is an entirely different web server altogether. That could be the case. if you wanted to easily copy all the connections that we did and all the queries we just did, let me show you where all that information is stored. So you don't really have to use the configuration tools to do it. Yes, they're pretty simple. Mouse clicks, a couple little types on the keyboard, and you can set them up. But if you have a really long password and all that kind of stuff, if you go to the template folder under resources, you'll see a settings database connections PHP file. We open that. This is the connections that you created. You can actually just copy and paste them over into the other file that's in the production level. Now the password is encrypted here, and you have to use the editor if you want to change that password, but copying and pasting should be just fine because it uses the same encryption on both levels. So that's kind of an easy way to copy your connections. If you want to do the queries, settings database queries, and there's our two queries again. I can just copy those over and paste them over into production level. Probably an easier way to do if you're familiar with file systems and copy and pasting real fast. That's pretty much it for this video. There's a lot more documentation on admin tools and on the website. Go there, and happy coding.